Here's the paradox that should keep you awake at night.
What if I told you?
Governments around the world
now owe nearly a
Mountain of debt.
double what they owed.
where it crushes the economy.
Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes over 30 trillion. Japan owes close to 10. The entire planet owes over 300 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But if everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? The answer isn't what you think. When you follow the chain of creditors, you discover something disturbing. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. But 4 men across 3 centuries designed it that way, deliberately. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward. This isn't conspiracy, this is documented history. And once you see how they built it, you'll understand why that massive debt number isn't a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. Every escape route leads back inside. Try to pay off the debt, and the money supply collapses. Try to default, and the financial system seizes. Try to inflate it away, and you destroy the currency. It's not a puzzle. It's a machine engineered to run forever, extracting interest from taxpayers and delivering it to institutions that never built anything, just lent money and collected rent on it for centuries. Before the first gear was installed, kings borrowed money the old way: approach merchants, promise repayment, and if they couldn't pay, default. Creditors lost money. The system cleared. William Paterson changed everything in the late 17th century. He was a Scottish merchant who'd failed multiple times to get rich, but he had an idea that would reshape civilization. England was at war and desperately needed money. Traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had defaulted before. Paterson approached the king with a proposal: organize wealthy merchants to lend the government a massive sum. But here's the innovation: the loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest forever. And to manage this, Paterson proposed creating the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. Merchant lenders would give their gold to the bank. The bank would lend it to the government. The government would pay interest annually from tax revenue. But the government wouldn't repay the principal, ever. The loan was permanent. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's taxing power. As long as England could tax its citizens, the interest would flow. And the banknotes the lenders received could be traded. They were as good as money, better actually, because they paid interest. Parliament approved the scheme. The Bank of England was chartered, and for the first time in history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, a feature of the system. But Paterson's real genius was what came next. The Bank of England could issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money out of debt. The government's IOU became currency. And the more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. This is the template. Government borrows, never repays principal, pays interest forever, and the debt itself becomes money. Within decades, every major European power copied the model. The debt trap was set, and every government since has walked into it willingly. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt, but there was no organized market. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. The Rothschild family had established banking houses across major European cities, creating an unprecedented network. Nathan, operating from London, arranged loans for Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. But his innovation was how he structured them. Instead of lending directly to the government, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. Government got money fast. Rothschild collected the spread. Investors got tradable assets, and Rothschild positioned himself so governments had no choice but to use him. Here's why this matters for the debt trap. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically default, but Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible because it would trigger systemic collapse. Governments had to keep paying and keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, it was inescapable. By the early 20th century, America was becoming an economic powerhouse, but had a primitive financial system. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not for the public good, but to protect his banking empire. After a financial panic, Morgan personally organized a bailout, but he was aging and knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution, a central bank. But Americans hated central banks, so they disguised it. In a secret meeting, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were secret because if the public knew bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be riots. The plan was brilliant. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called a central bank. It would look decentralized and democratic. But the structure ensured banker control. The regional banks were privately owned, and the most important power, creating money and buying government bonds, was given to the New York Fed, controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress largely because most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for, and immediately, the debt trap expanded. Now the government borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. Here's why this matters. The Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. The government issues a bond, the Fed buys it with newly created money. The government spends the money, and the debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing but the promise that taxpayers will service it forever. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds. The government can roll over debt forever, and interest payments flow from taxpayers to the banks that own the Federal Reserve System. By the late 20th century, the debt trap was functioning globally. But developing nations were different. Many couldn't keep up payments. The trap was reaching its limits until Paul Volcker made it permanent. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman in the early 80s facing runaway inflation. He raised interest rates dramatically to crush it. But this had another effect. Developing nations had borrowed billions when rates were low. Now the interest rates had tripled. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they couldn't pay. This should have triggered global collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. If these countries defaulted, major banks would fail. Volcker could have let the market clear, but he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend these countries enough to keep making interest payments to American banks. The loans came with brutal conditions: cut spending, privatize assets, open markets to foreign investment. Basically, dismantle economic sovereignty in exchange for money to keep paying interest. And here's the key. The IMF loans didn't reduce debt. They just rolled it over, made it manageable but permanent. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it. Restructure it. Lend enough to keep interest payments flowing and extract political concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to surrender sovereignty in exchange for staying in debt. This pattern has repeated for decades. Same structure every time. Restructure, don't forgive, keep the interest flowing. Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is impossible. Patterson's model. Government borrows, pays interest forever, never repays principal. Rothschild's innovation. Make the debt tradable globally so default collapses the entire system. Morgan's mechanism. Central banks create money to buy government bonds. Unlimited demand. Volcker's trap. When countries can't pay, restructure, don't forgive, keep the interest flowing. The result is what we have today. Over $300 trillion in global debt. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest. And all of it is connected, so default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Here's the specific mechanism. The US government issues massive debt. Who owns it? About half is owned by pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve. These institutions buy treasury bonds because they're safe assets, but those bonds pay interest from taxes, so taxpayers send money to the government. The government sends it to bondholders, mostly institutions owned by the wealthy. It's a transfer from workers to capital every year, forever. Scale it globally. Every country runs the same system, and they're all interconnected. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest flows upward to the institutions that manage the debt. Here's why this can never end. If the US paid off its debt, the money supply would collapse. Because dollars are created when the government borrows, pay off the debt and those dollars disappear. Deflation, depression, collapse. So the government can never pay it off. It has to keep borrowing, keep rolling it over, keep paying interest. The same is true globally. If every government paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money to conduct trade. So debt can't be eliminated. It's structural, necessary by design. And here's who profits: massive asset managers controlling tens of trillions. They buy government bonds with other people's money and collect the interest. That interest flows from taxpayers to bondholders, the largest wealth transfer in history, continuous and invisible because it's not called a tax. It's called debt service. The four architects didn't conspire together. They lived in different centuries. But each solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers, and each solution built on the previous one. Together, they built a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not taxpayers, the financial institutions. Here's the final truth. Massive debt isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset paying interest. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will pay interest even if it never repays principal, the system functions. The debt trap is complete. Escape isn't possible without collapsing the entire financial system. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 machine. And everyone on Earth is now caught inside it, paying rent to live in a system they never agreed to build but can never leave. The machine doesn't care whether we understand how it works, but we should.